You're about to hear the full, true story of Kathy Hobbs, a quiet teenager from Las Vegas who vanished one night in 1987, only to be found murdered days later. Her case haunted investigators for decades, became one of the most discussed cold cases from the 1980s, and was eventually linked to a known serial killer. But the circumstances around who did it and why are as chilling as the crime itself. This is the story of Kathy Hobbs, the girl who predicted her own death and whose murder still raises questions years later. Kathy Hobbs was born and raised in Las Vegas, Nevada. She was a teenager with a vivid imagination and a deep sensitivity about life and death. Long before she ever went missing, Kathy expressed a fear that she wouldn't live past the age of 16. Friends and family later recalled that she mentioned this repeatedly, sometimes casually, sometimes with deep anxiety. This wasn't a joke or teenage exaggeration. By the time she reached her mid-teens, this fear had become part of her personality. She struggled with stress and worry, and some who knew her said it affected how she lived day to day. On her 16th birthday, she's reportedly relieved. She believed she had passed the age she had always feared. She turned 16 in April 1987, breathed a sigh of relief, and started to make plans for the future. She enrolled as a beauty student and began living a more normal teen life. But what happened next turned every hope her family had on its head. The date was July 23, 1987. Kathy told her mother she was going to walk to the corner store near their home, a short trip, one she had made many times before. She let her mom know what she was doing, and her mother went to bed, assuming Kathy would be back soon. Around 11:17 p.m. that night, store records confirmed that Kathy purchased a book. The clerk later said she seemed normal and calm. She wore a white jacket and pink pants, important details that would matter later. After that purchase, she was never seen alive again. Her mother didn't notice anything unusual until the next morning when Kathy didn't return home. By then, it was clear something was wrong. When Kathy didn't come home, her mother called the police and reported her missing. This was unusual. This frightened a family who had already lived through years of worry over her strange premonitions. Officers began canvassing the area, but there were no signs, no sightings, and no leads at first. Then, 9 days after she disappeared, a geologist named Rick Picault was hiking in a remote area of the desert near Lake Mead, about an hour's drive from her home. He noticed a strange odor and followed it, discovering a body lying in the dirt. It was Kathy Hobbs. She was found several miles from her home, alone in the desert, her body showing clear signs of brutality. When investigators arrived, they documented tire tracks at the scene. A vehicle had pulled in, turned around, and left. Nearby, 2 large rocks were spattered with blood. These rocks would later prove significant in understanding her final moments. The coroner's report was grim. The cause of death was repeated blows to the head, blunt force trauma inflicted with considerable strength. Kathy had been sexually assaulted before her death. Her clothes were torn, and her body was left in the harsh desert heat. Blood evidence found on the rocks was matched to her. Investigators immediately knew this was no accident. This was a murder. Someone had picked her up, taken her to that remote place, assaulted her, and killed her before leaving her body behind. But who? At the scene, there were no witnesses. There were no obvious fingerprints. What they did have were tire tracks, the rocks stained with blood, and a tragic young life cut short. Weeks after Kathy's body was found, something strange happened. On October 24, 1987, the Las Vegas Police Department received an anonymous message on their answering machine. The voice was male, calm, detailed. The caller said he had seen someone grab Kathy outside the store, where she bought her book, and push her into a car. He described her clothing correctly: white jacket, pink pants, and even said one of the men involved was named Robbie. He told police where she was taken and how it happened. But there was a problem. He didn't leave a name or phone number. When investigators checked the license plate number he provided, it turned out to be fake. Police publicly appealed for the caller to come forward. They never heard from him again. The anonymous tip remains one of the most mysterious pieces of this case, because it matched details only someone present at the time could know. For years, the case seemed unsolvable. Detectives interviewed hundreds of people, examined every lead, re-examined evidence, but nothing concrete came up. Then attention turned to Michael Lee Lockhart, a convicted serial killer from Walbridge, Ohio. Lockhart had been arrested for multiple murders in Texas, Indiana, and Florida. He was known to have been traveling through Las Vegas in 1987, at the exact time Kathy disappeared. Here's what made him a person of interest. He stole a blue 1986 Toyota Celica that was documented in Las Vegas that year. Fibers from that vehicle were later matched to trace evidence found near Kathy's body. Investigators also found receipts and records placing him in the area at the right time. When questioned, Lockhart spoke in ways that investigators later described as a virtual confession. He didn't confess in court, but his statements hinted strongly that he was involved in her murder. Lockhart was convicted of other murders and later executed in Texas in 1997 for those crimes. Because he was already on death row, authorities did not pursue a separate trial for Kathy's murder, but most investigators now believe he was responsible. This means the case is technically closed, even if no formal conviction was entered specifically for Kathy's death. Why would someone like Lockhart kill Kathy? Serial killers driven by sexual violence and opportunity often follow patterns. Opportunity. Kathy was alone at night. Vulnerability. She was walking by herself in a familiar but quiet neighborhood. Predator behavior. Lockhart's known crimes all involve attacking young women. From a criminal profile perspective, this attack fits Lockhart's known modus operandi, preying on young women, using vehicles to abduct them, and carrying out violence in isolated areas. There's no evidence that Kathy knew Lockhart or that this was planned. It appears to have been a crime of opportunity, carried out by a violent predator in the area. Kathy's death devastated her family. Her mother and father, her siblings, and even neighbors struggled with grief, guilt, and unanswered questions. After her death, the family found letters Kathy had written before her 16th birthday. Letters addressed to family members, telling them how much she loved them and asking them not to grieve too deeply if something happened to her. These letters have become a haunting part of her story because they showed how deeply she feared her own mortality, even before anyone could have predicted what would happen. For decades, the case remained in public memory, largely because of the mystery around it. It was featured on documentaries and true crime shows. People debated the anonymous caller. Fans of unsolved mysteries argued whether the license plate clue was real or a hoax. Some even questioned whether Lockhart really did it. But police departments and forensic teams continued to treat it seriously. Eventually, with the link to Lockhart and the closing of the investigation, authorities consider the case closed, meaning they have identified the most likely perpetrator, even though no separate trial or conviction occurred for this specific murder. That doesn't erase the pain, but it does bring a measure of resolution. Today, the story of Kathy Hobbs remains one of the most talked about teen murder cases from the 1980s. It raises hard questions. How many predators traveled through cities like Las Vegas without ever being stopped? How critical are timely witness reports in solving crimes? And how does a single anonymous tip change the course of an investigation, for better or worse? Most importantly, it reminds us that behind every case file, every statistic, and every cold case board, there was a real person, someone with hopes, fears, dreams, and a life that should have continued. Kathy Hobbs never got the chance to grow up. She never got to see adulthood. But the efforts to understand what happened to her and why it happened have made her story known, a sober reminder of the fragility of life and the drive of investigators who refuse to forget. If you found this story meaningful and want to learn more about real cases like this, solved and unsolved, subscribe to Truth Trove Stories. We dig into these mysteries with respect, depth, and a commitment to truth. Thanks for listening. Stay safe, and we'll see you in the next story. It was a quiet Sunday morning in Burlington, Vermont. The kind of morning where nothing feels urgent. No sirens, no raised voices. Just another day beginning. But inside a small apartment, building near the University of Vermont. A young woman lay dead. Her name was Rita Curran. She was 24 years old. For more than half a century, her killer had no name. No arrest. No trial. Only questions. Until 2022. This is the full story of Rita Curran. Who she was, what happened to her, and why the truth took 51 years to surface. Rita Curran was born in 1947 and raised in Vermont. She was known as quiet, thoughtful, and reliable. By 1971, she was living independently in Burlington in a modest apartment building at 413 South Winooski Avenue, just blocks from the University of Vermont. She worked as a medical technologist at the university's medical center. It was demanding work, precise, technical, and often behind the scenes. Rita wasn't reckless. She didn't live dangerously. She wasn't surrounded by chaos. She was simply a young woman building a life. And that is what makes this case so disturbing. On Saturday night, July 18th, 1971, Rita was home in her apartment. There is no evidence of a party. No signs of visitors coming and going. Nothing unusual reported. By the morning of Sunday, July 19th, Rita failed to appear where she was expected. Concern grew. When someone went to check on her apartment and entered, what they found was immediately horrifying. Rita Curran was lying on her bed. She was naked from the waist down. She had been strangled. There were clear signs of sexual assault. She was already gone. Police arrived quickly. The apartment showed no signs of forced entry. Nothing broken. Nothing smashed. This detail mattered. It meant Rita either knew her attacker, or the attacker had easy access to the building. Evidence was collected carefully, thoroughly, and with the best tools available in 1971. But that year mattered too, because in 1971, DNA technology did not exist. Detectives interviewed neighbors, coworkers, friends, and anyone who had crossed paths with Rita. They looked closely at the people closest to her. One man immediately stood out. He lived in the same building, just 2 doors down from Rita. His name was William DeWitt. William DeWitt was 43 years old. He was an Air Force veteran, quiet, socially awkward, largely unnoticed. But police uncovered troubling details. DeWitt had a history of sexual misconduct. He had previously been investigated for attempted sexual assault. He lived close enough to observe Rita's routine. He had access to the building. He was questioned by police. But suspicion is not proof. And in 1971, proof was everything. Without DNA, without eyewitnesses, without a confession, police could not move forward. And then William DeWitt left Vermont. Shortly after Rita's murder, he relocated to Washington State. At the time, it raised eyebrows. But again, suspicion wasn't enough. The case slowly went cold. Rita Curran became another name in an unsolved file. Years turned into decades. Rita's family aged without answers. Investigators retired. Leads dried up. But one thing did not disappear: the evidence. Biological material collected in 1971 was preserved, stored, protected, waiting. In Washington State, William DeWitt lived quietly. There are no known confessions, no attempts to clear his conscience. In 1983, DeWitt died by suicide. At the time, no one publicly connected him to Rita Curran's murder. To the world, he was just another man whose life ended without explanation. But truth does not depend on confession. By the late 2010s, cold cases across the country began reopening, not because of witnesses, but because of genetic genealogy. In 2021, Burlington police reopened the Rita Curran case. DNA from the crime scene was analyzed using modern methods. Instead of looking for a direct match, investigators looked for family connections, distant relatives, shared genetic markers, hidden links. Slowly, a family tree formed, and every branch pointed back to one man. William DeWitt. Though he had been dead for decades, his DNA signature lived on through his relatives. Investigators compared crime scene DNA with DNA from DeWitt's family. The match was conclusive. There was no doubt. In 2022, Burlington police made the announcement. The murder of Rita Curran was solved. Her killer was William DeWitt. He acted alone. There were no accomplices. Rita Curran was 24 years old when her life was taken. For 51 years, her killer lived and died without accountability. But truth has a way of resurfacing. Cold cases don't disappear. They wait. This was Rita Curran's story, and it deserved to be told. If you believe careful, respectful storytelling matters, subscribe to Truth Trove Stories. Thank you for watching. In small towns, violence rarely announces itself. It hides behind front doors. It lowers its voice. It waits for privacy. Margaret Federoff lived in one of those towns. Pennsylvania, late 1970s. A place where neighbors waved, routines repeated, and marriages were assumed to be safe. Margaret's death would be labeled an accident for decades, but it was not an accident. It was a murder, and the man who did it was the man who shared her bed. This is not the story of how a woman died. This is the story of how the truth was buried and why it took 44 years to rise. Before she became a case file, Margaret was a person. She was a mother. She was a wife. She was a woman trying to hold a life together in a time when women were expected to endure, not escape. Margaret lived with her husband, Paul Federoff, in Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania. The house was modest. Nothing about it suggested danger. Her days were predictable, caring for her children, managing the home, navigating a marriage that looked stable from the outside. But predictability can be a mask. Those close to Margaret noticed changes. She had grown quieter, more guarded, not unhappy in a dramatic way, unhappy in a tired way. The kind of unhappiness that comes from living with tension every day. Paul Federoff was not a stranger to the community. He worked. He paid his bills. He looked like every other husband on the block. There were no police records, no public scandals, which is exactly why no one looked closely at him. Inside the home, Paul needed control. He wanted authority. He wanted obedience. And he wanted his marriage to remain exactly as it was, whether Margaret wanted that or not. Arguments were becoming more frequent. Voices raised. Doors closed harder than necessary. Margaret did not talk openly about everything. Women rarely did in 1978. But she talked enough. Enough for people to sense fear. Margaret had reached a breaking point. She was thinking about divorce. This matters. In the late 1970s, divorce was not just emotional, it was social risk. Financial uncertainty, custody fears, judgment. For Margaret, leaving meant stepping into the unknown. But staying meant something worse. She knew Paul would not take it well. He had made that clear. Control, once threatened, does not fade quietly. It resists. The day Margaret died began like any other. No alarms, no warnings. Inside the Federoff home, an argument started. What was about doesn't matter as much as what followed. Paul later said Margaret fell down the stairs. An accident. A tragic slip. When first responders arrived, Margaret was dead. Paul was composed. Cooperative. Certain. There were no signs of forced entry. No strangers. Just a husband. And a dead wife. Authorities accepted Paul's explanation quickly. The stairs were there. Falls happen. In 1978, forensic science was limited. Domestic violence was poorly understood. And husbands were rarely scrutinized unless blood covered the walls. Margaret's death was ruled an accident. The file was closed. Paul went home. Not everyone accepted the explanation. Margaret's injuries raised questions. The pattern didn't fully match a fall. But questions without power go nowhere. There was no loud family demanding justice. No media pressure. No social framework to question a husband's word. And so, doubt was swallowed. Paul Federoff continued his life. He remarried. He aged. He spoke of Margaret as a tragic memory. Nothing more. Years passed. Then decades. Margaret's children grew up without answers. Without a mother. The truth stayed silent. Not gone. Just waiting. Cold cases are not about the past. They're about mistakes that were never corrected. Margaret's case sat untouched for over 40 years. Until someone looked again. When investigators revisited Margaret's death, they didn't start with assumptions. They started with the body. Medical experts re-examined the injuries. And what they found changed everything. The marks on Margaret's neck, the damage to her throat, these are not consistent with a fall. They were consistent with manual strangulation. Hands. Someone had squeezed until breathing stopped. This meant only one thing. Paul Fedorov had lied. Margaret did not fall. She was killed. And the reason was no longer a mystery. She was leaving, and Paul could not allow that. Cases don't reopen because of time. They reopen because someone finally listens. Margaret Fedorov's death had been labeled an accident for decades. But medical understanding changed. And with it, old conclusions began to crumble. When investigators pulled the file from storage, the first thing they noticed wasn't what was there. It was what was missing. No deep analysis of neck injuries. No serious exploration of domestic conflict. No sustained questioning of the husband. In 1978, that absence felt normal. In the 2020s, it felt like negligence. The most important witness in any homicide is the victim. Margaret had been speaking the whole time. New forensic reviews focused on her neck, throat, and soft tissue damage. Experts reached the same conclusion independently. This was not blunt trauma from a fall. This was pressure, sustained pressure, hand applying force long enough to stop airflow and blood circulation. This wasn't panic. It wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. Investigators returned to the original scene description. The staircase, the body position, the lack of expected injuries. If Margaret had fallen, certain fractures should have been present. They were not. Instead, there were signs of a struggle. Small details ignored in 1978 now stood out clearly. The house had not been a place of sudden chaos. It had been a place of controlled violence. When Paul was first questioned decades earlier, his story was accepted at face value. This time, investigators read his statements line by line. The wording, the timing, the inconsistencies. Paul described an accident with certainty, too much certainty. There was no confusion, no soak, only a clean narrative delivered quickly. That's not how accidents usually sound. Investigators began speaking to people who had never been formally interviewed. Friends, relatives, those who had known Margaret in her final months. A pattern emerged. Margaret had been afraid. She had talked about leaving. She had talked about Paul's temper. She had talked about feeling trapped. None of that made it into the original case file. This wasn't random. Margaret's desire to leave threatened Paul's sense of control. Divorce meant exposure, loss of authority, loss of identity. To Paul, the marriage wasn't a partnership. It was possession, and possession does not let go willingly. Paul didn't get away with murder because he was clever. He got away with it because the system wasn't built to see him. In 1978, domestic violence was minimized. Women's fears were dismissed. Husbands were presumed truthful. The investigation stopped where it should have started. Once the medical conclusions were clear, there was no going back. Margaret's death was officially reclassified as a homicide. The name on the suspect line was obvious. Paul Fedorov. After 44 years, the lie had expired. In 2022, Paul was arrested. He was elderly, frail, no longer the man he had been in 1978. But age does not undo violence. When he was taken into custody, there was no dramatic confession, no apology, only silence. Paul Fedorov died in custody before the case could reach trial. There was no conviction, no verdict read aloud. For some, that felt incomplete. For others, it was enough that the truth was spoken publicly at last. Margaret's death was no longer an accident. It was recognized as murder. Margaret's children lived their lives under a false narrative. For decades, they were told their mother's death was a tragedy without blame. Now they knew. Their father had killed their mother. That truth doesn't bring peace. It brings clarity and grief delayed by decades. This case was not just about one man. It exposed how easily violence can hide when institutions choose convenience over doubt. Margaret had been telling the truth long before she died. No one listened. Margaret Fedorov did not get justice in time, but she got the truth. And truth has a way of arriving, even when it's decades late. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told carefully, without noise, without excuses, subscribe to Truth Trove Stories. Because some stories don't end. They wait.